Hello and welcome to Elevating Founders, the podcast for early stage founders to hear the stories behind the change makers and disruptors in the tech sector who are responsible for tackling the world's biggest challenges. Brought to you by London Tech Week and hosted by myself, Sina Sadzada. In this episode, we are celebrating International Women's Month with Kathleen Breitman. Kathleen is the co-founder of Tezos, a blockchain-based smart contract platform with an on-chain governance mechanism to coordinate and push upgrades to its network. Prior to Tezos, Kathleen was a senior strategy associate for R3, a blockchain consortium of more than 70 financial firms. She's also worked at Accenture, Bridgewater Associates, and The Wall Street Journal. This episode was personally one of my favorites, and I can't wait for you guys to listen. So without further ado, let's jump straight in. Okay, Kathleen, welcome to the podcast. It's very nice to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to really jump in because we're doing this episode for International Women's Month, and I as well personally, I'm within the Web3 space. I love Web3, and of course Tezos falls into that. Within the tech industry, though, female founders, especially, usually tokenized within industry. What advice could you really give to female founders?
So the temptation, I would say, inordinately being one of the few women in the cryptocurrency space has benefited me in the sense that Tezos doesn't have the biggest market cap. It's not the most popular cryptocurrency at any given time, but consistently we punch above our weight class in terms of media engagement, in terms of looking a bit more patrician. I think a lot of it's because it doesn't have the same sort of machismo and an aggressive gambling culture that a lot of other projects have adopted. And I like the expression, the fish rots from the head down. And so I think kind of being in an implicit leadership role in a sort of project and being a woman in a male-dominated field has helped us differentiate overwhelmingly. And it also means that I get way cooler invitations than than a lot of folks would probably constitute. So in some ways I am very much tokenized, but I try not to make it my entire identity. Some people only talk about their gender, they only talk about, kind of their role or their niche. And I find, use it for what it's good for, which is being a differentiator, and don't make it the entirety of what you want to be known for.
So how can, say, other women found, and you did sort of touch on it there, but how do they go from not making it their identity, but more focused around their skill sets?
Yeah, I would just say basically, I have a few friends who are also female founders in either this space or an adjacent space. And if they suspect that they're being invited to a conference because they're a girl, they get very upset.
Of course, yeah.
I just accept the invitation. It's just don't sweat too much that someone's inviting you for something. Appreciate the opportunity for what it is. And don't think too much about what your identity is in the context of the broader environment. Just see the opportunity and just try to seize it, because basically there's a lot of infrastructure around trying to give women basically overcompensating for the last 15 years when there were basically no notable female founders in large tech brands. And so a lot of folks are explicitly trying to reach out, and I would say just appreciate the opportunity and try to seize it, but don't make it the entirety of your identity.
Yeah.
I never start a sentence with "as a woman." Talk about get down to brass tacks, but also appreciate that someone's trying to help you.
That's a really good way of putting it, I think. So before we jump into more detail, it would be great to know, for those who don't know, what is Tezos?
Yeah. So Tezos is a cryptocurrency. It's a smart contract platform. One unique feature of Tezos that I've yet to see replicated by another cryptocurrency is using a supermajority of token holders. Basically, new technologies and new parts of the code base are proposed and ratified, usually on a 3-month cadence. So that's about 4 times a year. So Tezos is a blockchain that upgrades in a decentralized fashion.
Got you. And where's other blockchains?
Well, I guess the most notable contrast is probably Ethereum, which took about 8 years to upgrade to Ethereum 2.0, which was originally promised in 2014. And really the reason that happened was because they upgrade through something called a hard fork, which is more of a pain in the ass coordination mechanism than anything else. Whereas Tezos was designed with upgradability. That's not really a word, but it was designed with evolution in mind. And so basically there's a very formal forum And there's a very passive upgrade process. You don't have to like continuously sync and make sure that everyone's in check and have a big roadmap. It's just part of the game plan.
And then your own personal journey though. So you started, you've got experience within Accenture and R3. How did you actually recognize the opportunity to start a blockchain like Tezos, like Ethereum was around? And so what was the sort of like opportunity there?
So actually the proposal for Tezos and the proposal for Ethereum are almost from the exact same time, which is 2014. But basically like my husband was super early to Bitcoin. He has a very fateful email draft from 2008 saying I should check out this Bitcoin thing when it launches. It launched in 2009. He didn't right away, but he did, very shortly thereafter. What's a funny phenomenon as we get AI, which is like the hot thing right now, is like people who are experts always feel like they're last to come in. And actually, if you're that knowledgeable, you're usually quite first, but there's a little bit of like, I don't know, it's a version of imposter syndrome, I'm sure. But he got in like 2010 and got really into Bitcoin. And to be candid, and
I mean, most of them don't.
Yeah.
Most of the people that bought Bitcoin that early.
He drank the Kool-Aid. And so I had to hear about it. And so he was always like fiddling with side projects. And there was a sort of like je ne sais quoi, like we like the idea, like there's some ways that it's very egalitarian and very lovely. And yet we couldn't find a smart argument for it on the internet. And so there was like, there's a there, but everyone who's talking about this sounds like an idiot. Like there has to be a better way. And so almost born out of frustration that people were wrong on the web, Arthur started to like prototype what would, eventually become Tezos. But the I guess, number one, observation is that Bitcoin lacks a formal mechanism to upgrade itself, and that's all fine and good if you think that stasis is a benefit, which some people who really love Bitcoin do. But just looking at the technological landscape in 2008, 2009, like it wasn't best in class. There's been a lot of really cool innovation that's happened since, and it's been a struggle to cogently organize around that.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah. So when it came to writing the plan for Tezos, what was the sort of like turning point in terms of both development as well as like more mass adoption?
Yeah. So that's a good question. I guess it's in two parts almost. So there was this idea of like a blockchain that could upgrade itself. There's a few technical qualifications that the bar had to be crossed before that was entertained any further. So there was a small development shop in Paris that helped realize if that was a thing or not. So that was like maybe like early 2014. Once that like initial experiment was confirmed, there was basically just a group of dudes and maybe even some ladies like working on the code base for a while. But this is very early in the cryptocurrency era, and like a lot of the early companies were like really struggling and not doing very well. So it wasn't super obvious that anyone should.
What year was this?
2014.
Got you.
So it wasn't super obvious that anyone should really quit their jobs and run off and commit to this. By 2016, Ethereum had eventually launched, and its first like application that had any success or renown was called the DAO. Which was basically a smart contract that was meant to replicate the function of a venture capital firm. And it got a lot of like, I say celebrities, but they're like, celebrities with a lowercase c, because they're like crypto celebrities in 2015, to participate in like kind of promoting this.
Yeah.
And it failed spectacularly, meaning it was hacked, a few weeks after it launched. And a substantial amount of the Ethereum like tokens that were in circulation were absconded by a thief. And so this created a bit of a crisis in Ethereum land. And there was a little bit of like on Twitter, like, hey, whatever happened to those Tezos guys? And meanwhile, it had been like sort of a nights and weekends project for a lot of folks between Paris and where we lived in Mountain View. And I quit my job to basically see if it could be something bigger. And that was like maybe September 2016.
What made you think though? Because like in that was so early, right? It still is incredibly early now.
Yeah.
And like, what sort of like made you want to commit your full time to this? Like,
I was 26. It was low opportunity cost.
Right.
I think like to get me to do something like that bold and wacky now, it would take a lot more than just like, it's a good idea.
But like where at that time, where did you kind of see a blockchain like Tezos like going? You just saw what happened to Ethereum. Like, so what like,
I mean, you know, the not so secret is that like Ethereum for the first few years was basically amateur hour. Like Ethereum went down during its first major conference. Even the DAO hack, like, you know, basically the sort of vulnerability that was exploited was something that like is warned against explicitly in the Tezos position paper as like a reason to use formal verification. So it was kind of like, you know, on one hand, the industry wasn't very big. And it was that perfect combination of like the industry wasn't very big and the people who had been attracted to it like were just very amateurish. So it was a little bit of like being opportunistic, but also like there's a reason this industry hasn't been successful, and it's because it doesn't really value good engineering. And I guess we thought that would eclipse at some point. I think it's still like kind of off from now. Like you see a lot of projects going down for hours and hours on end and no one really like cares.
Like, all the time.
So I still don't think there's a big market for like good technological implementations, but you know, Tezos will be there when there is. So that was
I think I don't know what you think in terms of this, but I feel like the perspectives are changing to the point where people are now like very much when they're buying crypto, they're very much now looking towards the underlying technology rather than more the hype. I don't know if that's the current market condition that we're in, perhaps, but what do you kind of think?
We can aspire towards that. I think that's what the problem is. Like, there's a strong incentive to do what's called like decentralization theater.
Yeah.
You know, a cute little hack is like in the Ethereum proof of stake system. You know, you can pledge like 32 tokens, and that's like you know, a validator, and that's like a completely arbitrary thing.
Yeah, I didn't know
But it's
that.
just to say like, oh, you know, we have this many like, okay, well, you know, I suppose if you just call every token a validation token, you could also game that. So there's a really great management book, and it's you make what you measure, or adage really. But the idea is, you know, you kind of create incentives around rhetoric first, and sort of the proof is in the pudding. If you know, you actually have to land a rocket ship, you can't, you know, BS your way through that. But you know, in the cryptocurrency space, a lot of the cults of personality and a lot of this other stuff is predicated on people being unwilling or unable to do technical due diligence themselves. And the way that that's manifested has been to have like really sloppy projects deployed with gregarious figureheads who kind of assure you that everything will be okay, even when you know the house is on fire.
Before we go on to like more around helpful advice in terms of scaling startups, because I know like people are very interested in that, I'd love to get your view on, say, the industry at the moment in terms of like, what do you see in terms of positives and what do you see in terms of negatives in terms of the Web3 space as a whole?
I would say the positive is that the space finally has a reputation it deserves. So for the last year and a half, like basically a lot of things that were pretty much obviously outright scams were doing well. Basically because there was a big momentum upwards and no one wanted to be the impolite person pointing out that the emperor had no clothes.
Yeah.
And I think really like Terra Luna was the first shoe to drop. That created a big hole in the market. The bigger hole
in my pocket
was
as well.
oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I have a handful of friends who lost money on that.
No,
it was
wasn't
like
that much.
It was like a weird spread. It was like there was no single like profile.
Sorry to interrupt you, but it's just like people, I don't feel like people understand how big that Terra Luna thing was.
No,
like,
it's nuts.
It was like that was like a top 15 market cap coin. Like, it was actually massive.
The zombie coin that it left in its wake is still bigger than Tezos. So I mean, you know, but yeah. And then FTX, of course, being like the big
we'll talk about that in a bit more detail
of this. So like, I mean, listen, you know, these people were doing like objectively terrible things, and you know, in some ways like a strength of the space is that it kind of recovers no matter what, because it doesn't really rely on like a third party to intervene. It sort of like self-organizes in some ways. So that's a strength. Another strength I would say is like, I thought there was so much hopium and like complete nonsense being spewed about like what the capabilities of the software was, that like something had to give, and that it coincided with a larger macroeconomic downturn, because that like I've been through so many different crypto cycles, and like when the rest of the economy is thriving and crypto's down, that's when like it really gets kicked.
Oh yeah.
This is more like, hey, we all suffered the last few months. Like no one's really quite winning or losing compared to anyone else.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on the positive, like there are just going back to talent, like there's just much better people in the ecosystem now than there was like even 5 years ago. So it continues to attract really excellent talent. And I think like of the top, and this is a stat that I read on Twitter, so who knows the veracity of the statement.
Twitter.
Source Twitter. Yeah, that's my source for most things. But I think it's like the top 5 computer science departments in the US all have a course that discusses cryptocurrency or is dedicated to like quote unquote blockchain, like but cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
And that's encouraging because like, you meet the kids who come out of these programs and they're all like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and that's a sort of like enthusiasm, low opportunity cost, and sense of adventure that like actually pushes innovation forward.
For people listening, in terms of they've got their own Web3 startup, do you have any sort of advice and guidance for them, like growing, especially in this market?
Yeah. I like the Coco Chanel quote, "We can afford to be cheap."
Yeah.
I'm kind of like I know enough people who have children who are like in their early 20s that I'll speak to like friends' kids every now and again, and I do a lot of like scared straight, like they want to do the next FTX but better. I'm like, do you not see? But like really just like study why something hasn't existed before you try to go into it.
Yeah.
That is like the one folly of youth that I see repeated over and over again is not really indulging in Chesterton fences, not really like asking yourself why something's there in the first place. And I think a lot of that kind of goes back into different jurisdictions and different like obviously regulatory environments. A lot of the DeFi stuff, decentralized finance, touches on things that have analogous structures in like traditional finance, and like learn about that first before you start to do your alchemy in an open source context. So that's the sort of negative advice I would give. The positive advice would be like, hey, you're young, this is probably one of the fastest moving industries that anyone can get involved in. For better or for worse, most of these repositories are open sourced.
Yeah. And as well, another thing from like actually getting engaged in the industry, going to all these events that I go to, people are very willing to help. That's something that I've seen that's it's not unique to this industry, but it's a very big positive within this industry. People are willing to help, support, educate, and it's all these things that I think, I really love this industry for what it is. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good kumbaya sense. I got really into cryptocurrencies through Bitcoin before there was an Ethereum, and Bitcoin had like a much different tone to its culture than a lot of smart contract platforms. The smart contract platforms, your Ethereums, your Tezos, your Avalanche, your like all these kind of, all these different competitors within themselves. Like we all have pretty, like at least as a founder, like I have a pretty friendly relationship with a lot of my competitors in a way that you wouldn't expect based on how grumpy people are on Twitter. Twitter's not real life, but all it's to say like, I think there's more common understanding and more common goals. In the US, there's been like, some weird cutesy ways of trying to get kind of odious regulations into this space or implied in this space through things like a transportation bill that was going to tax NFTs. Like what? Like highways? What? And there was like a genuine like joint effort from different organizations and policy groups to like educate and push back on that. And you wouldn't have seen that 10 years ago. So.
You mentioned, Kathleen, from one of your answers about FTX. I was going to ask you a bit later to basically finish off the episode, but you mentioned it, so I thought it'd be relevant to talk about now. Firstly, like from your point of view, like how did that make you feel? And secondly, in terms of opportunities and setbacks, like what impact did FTX have on the overall industry?
I mean, I can't, it's funny, like a lot of comparisons have been drawn between Sam Bankman-Fried and Bernie Madoff, and for good cause, because they were both running Ponzi schemes. What's telling about like character is, Bernie Madoff, really bad person, still tried to keep his children and his wife out of being implied. Sam Bankman-Fried is like bringing his parents down with him. Like no, like this is like, sociopathic levels.
Yeah, the guy doesn't care.
Yeah, he doesn't care.
Yeah.
I've never seen someone so like simultaneously self-destructive and lacking entirely like any
He
self-awareness.
was playing League of Legends like while the whole like while they were talking to him on like Zoom calls and being like, let's try to fix this.
And
he was like
and he
on
stunk,
League.
and
He was like playing
stunk
League of Legends.
and he stinks at League of Legends. Like if you're gonna like coast
I don't know
off,
about
like
that.
oh no, he's like a
I
bronze
don't
player.
know.
AOC, who's like a sort of celebrity congresswoman in the U.S., is like an elite player, and like that
Is
was
she? I
her.
didn't know.
That was her one contribution to the discourse that I thought was absolutely hilarious. So it's like he's not even good at doing like the sort of rude.
Maybe he's
and
just practicing then, I guess.
he seems to need it, right? And now he has a flip phone because he was using a VPN, and like he couldn't just say he was looking at porn. He had to say he was like trying to get on to watch the Super Bowl. Like
Yeah.
he's just like a bad liar. So it's embarrassing. It's mostly embarrassing for the space that like there were so many patrician VC firms and like people who were like, I don't know about this crypto thing, but this Sam Bankman-Fried kid seems great. He was like the exception for a lot of people.
He was like a whiz kid, right? Like that's what he was considered as.
I
Yeah.
don't- the thing is, like, he has maybe I shouldn't be inviting comparison, but he has an eerily similar background to my husband. My husband went to like the MIT of France and then worked at an elite hedge fund doing ETF market making. Like, I don't know, like maybe that doesn't like faze me as much because like it's like those are pretty standard credentials in a lot of like competitive finance jobs.
Yeah.
A lot of what people were making good arbitrages on over the last few years in crypto were that there were these really sloppy like DeFi systems built by amateurs, and you'd meet someone at Jump or Jane Street or one of these places, and they would just jump in and exploit the hell out of them. The profile that Sam was in, he wasn't an ideologue, and I think Jeff Roberts at Fortune made the point before like he was kind of exposed as a crook, that it was kind of weird to have a figurehead who didn't have an ideological origin story. Anyway, FTX never listed Tezos, so as far as I'm concerned, that was everyone's fair warning sign. That should have been the tell from the jump, but here we are. But yeah, I put everyone back quite a bit, and I think like showed to be like an extraordinarily
I think it was more
human.
the credibility of the space.
Yeah,
I think
big time.
Yeah. But in terms of, so back to the question, in terms of opportunity, so you talked about the setbacks.
Yeah.
Were there any opportunities that came from this that you can see?
I mean, no, it's been pretty much a net negative. I think like the one thing that it's done. So I think a lot of the distortion in the market from the last 2 years has been because venture capitalists were coming in and pumping in like absurd amounts of money and insane valuations. So if there's one silver lining, it's that a lot of the valuations that seemed indefensible even in a very frothy market are definitely indefensible now. So hopefully you'll see like the breakdown and the culling of a few projects that like kind of never deserved to exist. But again, like that ties back to the fact that that's not a good outcome. It's a sensible outcome, and I feel less like I'm taking crazy pills. But it's still like I feel bad when people lose their jobs. It's like it's not their fault that people,
The people at the top mismanaged.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've talked about how the space has changed, both in terms of tech and Web3 specifically. So yeah, we've already spoken about that. But in terms of what needs to happen in like leveling the playing field for underrepresented founders and people who are working in the space, like, what are your thoughts there?
I mean, it's funny. It was just International Women's Day, and there was like I got all these like promotional emails from like the place where I buy my linens and places where I buy my clothes and a podcast I listened to once, all telling me how much they support women. I'm like, great, well then hire them. Like this, it doesn't take much. Like if you want to equal the playing field, like hire more women. But unfortunately like, people talk a big game with like what they want to do. But if you look around the offices, a lot of these startups, they look all demographically very similar. Which isn't to say that, diversity of ideas isn't important as well as anything else, but just, on the face of it, like I have a number of like, girlfriends who are like interested in coming into the cryptocurrency space in some form or another. And they don't necessarily want to work with an L1 like Tezos, but maybe they want to work for an exchange or whatever. And they get like lowballed, right? Like on their comp and things like this, and they just go back to their big tech company because the pay is more equitable in general for a larger company. So I mean, yeah, if you want more women or more diversity in your workforce, hire them. It's as simple as that.
And I guess the advice goes more towards the decision makers rather than the actual people that want to work in the space, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, there's also like just rank misogyny and like, tone, but I don't think you're going to like, in the cryptocurrency space, at least, it takes on this like really aggressive tone that a lot of folks like really just, well, a lot of women, frankly, are immediately turned off by. One of the things I'm most proud of is like visits to the Tezos.com website was at like gender parity, which I don't think really happens to many cryptocurrency projects.
No, I've never heard that.
But yeah, I mean, at least the month that I
maybe like World of Women NFTs, but that's
maybe
completely separate.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But all it's to say, like, I there are a lot of like female creators who mint NFTs on Tezos. And the overwhelming feedback that I get, which I don't deserve any credit for, is that like the Tezos community feels like a genuinely like more wholesome version of a crypto project. So yeah, I mean, there's only so much you can do about like vitriol on the internet, which is like an uphill battle that we're going to be fighting for probably the next few decades.
Yeah.
But what you can do is like try to reach out and try to like be a part of the solution by being, welcoming, and very nice, to people, even when, it requires turning the other cheek. And yeah, if you're in a position of power where you can hire someone, like, try your best to spread a wide net. The best way to find a female candidate is to ask a strong woman in your network, who they would recommend, because it tends to be that like attracts like.
That's very true. So you also talked about you've got female friends that want to go in the space, but they get lowballed. In terms of the other way around, in terms of like your female friends that want to get into the space but start their own companies, what advice do you have for female founders right now getting into the Web3 space in terms of like fundraising, growth, recruitment, like everything?
Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate thing is like venture dollars really have dried up in the space, so it's probably harder than ever to get funding, or harder than it has been in the last 4 or 5 years. I don't think there's like anything gender specific I would recommend. Just like hang in there, and like try not to take rejection personally. Like just always be happy. Like even in the face of like really really poor odds, because I think people remember tone and your character in the face of rejection and in the face of like sometimes harsh feedback as part of your profile. And there have been a handful of times where like someone passed on an opportunity with me, or they didn't want to like give money to something that I was doing, and you just stay friendly and stay in touch, and like maybe it genuinely wasn't a good opportunity for them 6 months ago, but it will be in 6 months. So I guess I would just say like keep your chin up. Try to be a happy warrior. I think, every now and again, like I'll get a pitch and I decline. And I always remember the people who send a gracious note after, thanking me for my time anyway, over the people who like ghost and just I never hear from again.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, I mean, that's some more general career advice, but I think it's unfortunately particularly important for women because, a lot of the attitudes and things that you kind of venerate in male founders are often characterized as bitchiness in a female founder. Like I'm thinking of, there was this awful hit piece on the co-founder of Away, the luggage company. And like she was kind of playing hardball with her employees and kind of being a little gruff from some of the messages. But like, I mean, I've worked at hedge funds. I worked in corporate environments. That's like basically a compliment in some of the places where I've worked.
Yeah.
So it's just like when it comes from a woman, it gets treated a little differently. So unfortunately, the bar for being pleasant in the face of difficulty is much higher.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Very last question. Actually, I've got one question of my own but like for this one. So within this industry, that within Web3, as you said, like there's probably less good attention compared to when the bull market was happening. But one market that's definitely taken off within the last like few months, I would say, is generative AI. And it's quite funny. A lot of the people that were experts in Web3 a few months ago are now experts in like generative AI. But that's another topic of discussion. What impact do you think AI and generative AI will have on the crypto and blockchain space?
Yeah, so it's funny. Two things. My poor, long-suffering husband happens to be an expert in AI and also in cryptocurrencies, and he gave a talk a few years ago about how they were entirely dissimilar, which is a tragedy because then he had to learn two things instead of one. But he was working at Waymo and self-driving cars prior full time, so he thinks about this a lot. He mostly thinks about AI in the sense of like, obviously opportunities and cool stuff that can be automated, but when it comes to cryptocurrencies, like fewer and fewer applications, right? I think though that what's been cool is like some of the most popular art on the Tezos blockchain, art like AI art.
Yeah.
And what's cool is like it kind of tends to be that those artists are also very technically savvy. So they kind of like come for the art and stay for the programming. And it's really built this like nice organic community.
Yeah.
Because I find that like basically nerds have a lot of like common, interests. And it's nice to see like some of them get, I don't know, the expression from XKCD is nerd sniped, and kind of fall down the rabbit hole both ways. So come for the art, stay for the block explorers or whatever.
Nice.
Yeah.
And then I want to ask you in terms of where do you see the next step within the crypto industry? Like, where do you see it going now?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's unfortunately, the other day, for example, like a big bank in the US that was like a main bank for a lot of big crypto firms, Silvergate, announced that it's going to be liquidated.
Market went down because of it.
Yeah. You bet it did. But it's very much the case that a lot of like the central actors that were onboarding folks into this ecosystem, like, are really poorly managed in general, like FTX being, of course, like the Mac Daddy of this, and like perhaps the most embarrassing example given the institutional money flowing into it. But all it's to say, like, no, it's been a really poorly managed industry. And I guess like our best hope is that the next generation of entrepreneurs who come into this learn from the mistakes of folks before. One thing that's striking, I mentioned Bernie Madoff as a comparison for which has been made often, like quite a bit in the media. Another comparison is Enron, which did you look at the history of Enron, you look at the history of FTX, and it is almost embarrassing down to the tagline, made for traders by traders.
Yeah.
It's like they took the same playbook and changed nothing. So what's the expression?
I made it worse as well. Like this was worse in my opinion.
Yeah,
than Enron.
I mean,
personally, that's what I think.
It's disastrous any way you cut it.
Yeah.
Just different groups of people, right? But all it's to say, like, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And that goes like double when it comes to like things like software and like kind of esoteric business models.
Got you. And before you go on to the quickfire questions, I want to ask you, like, what do you think about NFTs?
Oh, I mean, I love the concept. It's funny, like, I love art. I'm not a collector by nature. I've noticed that that's like an archetype. But yeah, minting on the Tezos blockchain, even throughout the bear market, has gone up. And a lot of the marketplaces on Tezos have seen their best months over the course of like the most deepest, darkest, coldest crypto winter. So I think from a cultural perspective, it's really lovely. I like the tone and the tenor that it brings to the currency space, just being selfish. And yeah, it's been like one of the few ways that I've seen women come to the come to the industry. So I'll take what I can get. Yeah.
But it could be more than just art as well in the future, right? Like, where do you see the future of that?
I think music is far more. I mean, I used to collect music back in the day, and now I just stream everything on Spotify. And so I think like music NFTs are a nice way to kind of bridge that cultural gap that like I sort of grew up with, children today won't have grown up with, but maybe could in the future, is like collecting music. one of the big success stories of the Tezos blockchain over the last year has been that it's used by a number of gaming studios. And so I think like NFTs for in-game items are a trickier conversation, probably a longer conversation, but that's potentially something that's interesting, if it can, find the right champion and find like a fun game. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Kathleen, I've absolutely loved talking to you. So we're just going to wrap up the podcast with 3 quick fire questions. And we always wrap up the podcast like this. So very first question, if you could go to the pub with any entrepreneur, who would you choose?
Oh, I mean, I would want to talk to Jeff Bezos sober. I would want to talk to Elon Musk after a few drinks. There are so many questions about his life choices.
Yeah, common answers. What's a startup you're loving at the moment and why? And Tezos probably isn't a startup anymore, but like you can't say Tezos.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what bucket Tezos falls into, but there's a group of guys and I think a few girls who work on this project DNS.xyz, which is like domain name services that it's on Tezos, it's on Ethereum. It's just like a really good group and they all come from product land. Like
tokenizing domain names.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good industry.
It's a great one.
Underrated. People aren't really looking at it, but the amount of liquidity you can get with that is huge.
Yeah, and it's like a really good team. So like they come from a product background, and I feel like that's what's really lacking in a lot of the cryptocurrency space is like this product mindset. Think about the user first, not like what sort of weird dance on the edge of the volcano you can do.
It's decentralized. Like, okay, so
what?
All right,
that and 275 brings you on the subway.
Yeah. Okay, last one. Fill in the blank. To be a founder, you must be
optimistic.
Optimistic's actually a new one. We haven't had that one before. I don't think we've had that one before.
I think you can't think too much about the odds.
We've had resilience. Yeah. We've had collaborative, but we haven't had optimistic. So that's a really good answer. So thank you.
Yeah.
All right, nice. Well, thank you so much for coming on again, and it's been an absolute pleasure. How can people stay in touch with you, Tezos, going into the future?
Sure. On all the social media things, I'm Bright Woman. So my last name is Breitman. I thought this was more feminist. Tezos.com. It was an unclaimed.com when we got it. So
really?
Yep, we're squatting on it.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That is it for this week's episode of Elevating Founders. Now, my question for you is, have you subscribed to the podcast yet? If not, now's the time. We've got some incredible episodes lined up for you this series, so keep an eye out. The next episode will be with you in the next couple of weeks. But in the meantime, though, why don't you catch up on our previous episodes? Thank you so much for listening again, and we'll catch you in the next episode.